Alright, so we've got one more step to kind of run through here of just setting up the generic NopCommerce items. I'm just going to add another class here to our root, and this is actually just going to be called our trialtracker plugin class file, and we'll add it. And every plugin needs to have this file. It just provides some additional information and methods for NopCommerce to work with for things like installing your plugin and adding it to menus and authentication and stuff like that. So this is pretty straightforward. We're actually just going to go ahead and inherit from base plugin, which is in nop.core.plugins, and then this will kind of help register our class with Nop as a plugin. And then we're also going to implement iAdminMenu plugin, which is an interface. And if we implement that method with a shortcut, you can see that includes an authenticate method and a build item menu method, which is used for adding items to the menu inside the admin area. So we can just return true for authenticate, and inside of our build menu item, this is pretty straightforward. NopCommerce 3.3 and 3.4 use sitemap nodes to build out their menu system. I think it was different before that in 3.2 and earlier, but I can't remember off the top of my head. So if you're working with either of those versions, all we need to do is say sitemap node and pull in our menu framework, and just say node equals new sitemap node, and we're just going to say visible equals true, which means it'll show up. And title, we're only going to have one menu item, and we're just going to call it trial tracker, and the URL that points to is going to be /trialtracker/manage. So again, our plugin just has one management page, and the title of our menu item where you click is just going to say trial tracker, and it'll take us to this page. And then obviously we just need to return the node after that. So there's two other methods that we're going to add real quick, and that's the install and uninstall method, and those are both from the base class. So we're just going to say public override void install, and you can see it plugs in base.install for us. And the other thing we want to do is run the install method of our context class that we created. If you remember, inside of our object context, we have this install method that executes our SQL command to build our database tables and everything like that. So back inside our plugin, we want to get access to that context, and we're actually going to do that using the dependency injection that we set up in the last lesson. So if we just say public trial tracker plugin, and then we can ask for a trial tracker record object context. And if we pull in the namespace for that, we can just call that context, and then we're also going to pull in an iRepository of trial tracker record. And remember, Nop is going to provide us with an implementation of this because we set that up in our dependency injection, and we're just going to call that trial repo or something like that. And then we can just assign those to two private variables. So I'll just say context equals context, and then create a field up above for that, and the same for our trial repository. And we may not actually end up using this repository in here, but I'm just adding it so that we have it in case we need it, and just to show you that we have that all hooked up. So inside of our install method, we're just going to call context.install. And so remember, context is hooked up to our trial tracker record object, or it is our trial record context, sorry. So we can call the install method on that and call the base install method. And then we also want to implement the uninstall, or override that. And so we can call base uninstall, but then we also want to call our context.uninstall. And remember, that will drop our database table and stuff that we created, because we define that method in our context. So that's actually good for now. We're going to be coming back to this class a couple times later in the series to add things like localization resources and some settings and stuff like that, but this should be good for now. So we can move on to the next lesson. So if you're still following along, we just finished our main plugin file, and now we're going to get more into the custom functionality of this plugin and really building beyond kind of the generic NopCommerce plugin setup. And we're going to start that process by building a custom view engine, which is not as scary as it sounds depending on your level of experience with MVC. But the problem we're trying to solve is that if we add views to our plugin project, by default the Razor view engine and even the Nop view engine are not going to find them. So those engines have specific places that they look for views and specific ways of finding them. If you read more about how the view engine works, that'll make more sense. But by default, our class library project is not part of those search locations. So all we're going to do is build a custom view engine that inherits from the themable view engine of Nop, and it just adds our plugin to the search location so that it can find it. And again, the main advantage of that is we can actually use Razor CSHTML files that'll get written out to the file system rather than compiling the views into our DLL. Because if we do it that way, we always have to refer to views with their fully qualified namespace name, and basically it just makes life a lot easier if the view engine just knows where to find them. So if you want to read more about that topic, I actually wrote a blog post about overriding and adding views with a NopCommerce plugin. That's at my blog, alexwolfthoughts.com, and it just kind of goes through this. And then on the same note, sort of a special call out to Woonchurk, which I hope I'm saying his name right, but he kind of started off this idea, and I just added some additional notes and explanations to it on my blog. So if we go back to our project here, then we can add a new class, and we'll just call this custom view engine, and we'll make that public. And this just has to inherit from the themable Razor view engine, I think it's called. Yeah. So the other thing we have to do to make this work is add an additional reference, and that reference is to SystemNet MVC. And to make sure I get the right one, I'm just going to browse to the root of our trialtracker install and go to packages. And inside of Microsoft.ASP.NET.MVC, we can get our DLL. And again, I just pick it from here to make sure we're using the same version as the rest of Nop to avoid conflicts. So we'll go ahead and add that. And now what that'll allow us to do is, inside of our constructor here, we can we get access to these two properties called partial view location formats and view location formats. So you can see here we have this property, and we're just going to add a new object here, and we're going to add the location of plugins, this.trialtracker, views.cshtml, and then we're going to add partial view formats for the same spot. And to give you a better idea of, what's actually going on here, if we open up our Nop solution directory and we go to presentation, remember we said nop.web is the project that's actually running. So what this is doing is it's telling this custom view engine to look inside of our compiled plugins folder, and then inside of our misc.trialtracker folder that we set up when we set the build output path earlier. And then inside of here, we can just copy our view files to this folder, and our custom view engine will know where to find those. And we'll look more at creating those views in a minute. But the last thing we have to do is actually register our view engine. And in order to do that, we need to create a route.config file, or route config file. So at the root of our project, we'll just say add new class, and we'll call it route config. And most NopCommerce plugins have this file. It just allows you to define routes like you would normally in MVC, and we'll look a little bit more at that later. I'll just say add, again make it public, and then it's going to implement iRouteProvider. And if we implement that interface, you can see that it defines this property and this register routes method. And I'm just going to return 0 here. And then we have to bring in system.web.routing. So if we actually go back to our references, I'm just going to say add reference, browse, sorry, I just paused for a second. We actually don't need to go into browse for that. That's actually just inside of one of our system assemblies. So if we close that and go to assemblies, and we just want to say, or add system.web. We forgot to add this earlier to our project. So then we can just say, using system.web, and or system.web.routing, sorry, and that'll bring in our route collection. So we're just going to leave that for now. We're not going to define any routes. We'll do that a little bit later. But the important thing is that we have to say view engines using system.web.mvc .engines.insert 0 new custom view engine. And the important thing here is this insert method. Notice that there's also an add method. We want to use insert because that's going to accept an index as well as our view engine. And when we say 0, that means to add it at the beginning. So our view engine is actually going to look first before the other view engines look, which means that the rules we defined in our view engines will apply first, because as soon as a view is found, the stop searches. That's just how the view engines work. So basically our plugin will be the first place search for any view, which is actually really powerful because it allows you to override views inside of nop.web and all kinds of things. So be careful with that because you can do almost anything with it. But now when we add views, our custom view engine will run first, and it'll look inside this location that we defined, and it'll find our views. So with that, we are ready to move on to the next lesson. So now that we have our custom view engine set up and everything like that, we're just going to take care of a few things that'll allow us to actually run our solution and get a better idea of where we're at with the plugin and just see it, just kind of see it in action. So the first thing we want to do is actually just add a route for our plugin management page, just so that we can actually get to that page. Without the route, we won't be able to do that. So I'm just going to paste in a route here for the management page, just because it's kind of a pain to write or to type out. This is a pretty standard MVC route. I just gave it a name of our plugin.manage trackers. You can call this whatever you want. But the path that I set for that is trialtracker/manage, because it's going to be our management page, and that just lets people know we're going to the trials tracker plugin. And then that path is going to map to the trial tracker controller that we'll create in a minute, and the manage action of that controller. And the last parameter that I passed in here is a namespace, and what that does is, if for some reason there's another controller with the same name, it tells MVC and the routing engine to prefer the controller that's in this namespace. This is just kind of a good idea to do so that your controller doesn't conflict with other plugins. In our case, that probably wouldn't happen, but if you have like a home controller or an admin controller, you can see how there might be naming conflicts down the road. So next we need to actually create that controller. I'm just going to add a folder called controllers, and then I'm just going to add a class to that, and we'll call that trial tracker or trial tracker controller, and we'll go ahead and make that public. And this needs to inherit from the base plugin controller, which is provided by Nop. And let's just go ahead and create our constructor for that. This controller is actually going to have various things that we need injected into it with our dependency injection. But for now, I'm just going to declare an iRepository of trial tracker record, because I know for sure that we'll need that. And I'll just call that trial repository. And let's make sure we bring in all of our namespaces here. And the other thing we're going to want is an actual reference to our content. But actually, no, I'm just going to leave this simple for now, because we're going to be doing a lot with this later. I'm just going to quickly create a private field here to store this. And then we can just create our action result for our management page. And we need to bring in system.mvc. So remember that route that we created maps to the trial tracker controller and the action method of manage. So here we created that manage action method, and we can just say return view, and it'll automatically look for a view called manage like it would with regular MVC. This is only possible because of the custom view engine we created. Otherwise we would have to pass in the fully qualified name of the view and all that. So you can see it's already making our lives easier. And then the last thing we have to do is actually create that view. So I'm just going to add a new folder called views. And inside of this I'm going to add, actually I'm just going to add a new item. Since this isn't an MVC project, we can't just add a new view easily. I'm just going to say general, just create a text file called manage.cshtml and manually give it that file extension. And inside of here, I'm just going to give it excuse me, the admin layout, which you can specify with underscore admin layout. And we'll just say hello world, because we're going to come back and build this out later. And a couple things we have to do with this file. We have to go into properties down here and say copy always, or copy if newer, but I prefer copy always. And we're going to mark that as content, and this makes sure the file just gets copied out to the file system so that Razor, or actually our custom view engine, can actually find it. The last thing we need to do here is actually create or just copy a web config from one of these other plugins. I mean, literally you just have to copy and paste it in, and this will help with serving up our Razor files. If you don't include that, you're going to get an error. And then while I had the video paused, I also noticed an error in our custom view engine. This was originally named /view, and we want that to be /views, so just make sure that's plural. I mean, if you want, you can leave it as view, but then you just have to call this view instead of views, and I think this makes more sense. And before we actually run this, let's just make sure that our output directory for the build is correct, which it looks like it is. Otherwise it won't show up in the admin if it can't find it in that compiled plugins folder. And just make sure that your description.txt file is set up correctly as well. And with that set, we are actually going to run and install our solution and see where our plugin's at in the next video. So now we've kind of come to the moment of truth where we're actually going to run the solution and see how everything goes. Before we do that, we need to create a database. I'm just going to do this in SQL Management Studio. So if you open up Studio and then I'm just connecting to local DB, but you can connect to whatever is appropriate for you. So I'm just going to say new database, and I'll call it NopTrial DB, and say OK. And now, if we go back to our solution, just basically clean your plugin. Whenever you make changes to a plugin, you always have to clean and rebuild, because Nop will cache DLLs, so anytime you make a change, just clean and rebuild. And then I'm actually just going to build the whole solution. And just to be safe, I'm actually going to clean and build, and this is partially just to show you that you might run into an error. Sometimes if you don't explicitly clean and build the first time, the admin project doesn't build properly, but that might have been resolved in newer versions, I'm not sure. So you can see here that our build fails, and that's because some of our references are tied to DLLs that get wiped out when you clean the solution, but those DLLs should have been rebuilt, so if you just build the whole thing again, it'll work. It's just that when you clean out those references, it's not going to work. We can look at fixing that a little bit later, but now that that's all set, I'm just going to run this by pressing Control F5, and we should get prompted for a login page. Or some type of install screen. So here at the install screen, we just need to enter in some basic information. I'm just going to keep the username and put in a simple password. Just go ahead and check create sample data. We're going to need some test data for our plugin, and it just makes the store look a little bit better. And I'm just going to say enter a raw connection string. And for the server name, we're just using local DB. So I'll just plug that in, and then we called that NopTrial DB, I believe. Then for user ID and password, I'm just going to replace that with trusted connection equals yes, so that it just uses my local credentials to install this. Then I'm just going to say install, and I'll go ahead and pause this while that's installed. So assuming your installation was successful, you should land on the Nop homepage, and then in order to get to the admin, we got to log in. So if I can remember this, it was admin@yourstore.com, I think. I'll just say remember me. And if we go to the admin page, Sometimes Nop runs kind of slow locally for me. I don't know if you guys have that issue too, but under configuration we can go to plugins, and you can see trialtracker is listed here. And for me it's already installed, so you can see I get this menu item up here and the drop down. If it's not already installed for you, you can click install and it should go through and create the database. If we actually look at our database, we can verify that that table for our trial tracker actually was created. So you can see we've got dbo.trialtracker, and it's got our columns, so we're good to go on that end. And if we go back to our plugin screen and we head over to the trial tracker management page, we get hello world. So it looks like we're in pretty good shape, and we're going to start building up this page. One other thing I want to show you, just to sort of reinforce this custom view engine idea that we touched on before. If I change this to manages or something different, and then clean and build, if I try to go back to this page, and we'll wait for this to reload, you can see I get this error message, which is actually a good thing in this case because it shows the searched locations. And if you notice this plugins, trial tracker, views, manage.cshtml, this is where it looked first, and then here is where the themable Razor engine kicked in. So you can see that our custom view engine is working, it is first, and our plugin is being searched first. And this is going to be really useful when we start overriding not views and adding in other functionality. So I'm just going to go ahead and change that back real quick, but I just wanted you to see that. And then just make sure that this is set to copy always in content, so that when you clean and build again, that it will overwrite that. Also, as a side note, you can see we're back to our hello world page, but if we actually go out to the folder on the file system, then if we go back to the root presentation nop.web to our compiled plugins, you can see that it actually outputs this view file with manage.cshtml, and that's what we're getting. So in the next lesson, we're actually going to start building up some of our views and making this seem more like a real plugin.